Why do men suffer in relationships, silently enduring emotional pain and confusion, while the world looks on and shrugs? You've probably heard it before. Men are often accused of being emotionally distant, of being unable to connect, to feel. Yet beneath the surface, many men are experiencing something far darker and more profound, a psychological suffering that is often masked by societal expectations and masked as mere relationship issues. What if the real problem lies not in the man himself, but in the unseen power dynamics at play, and more specifically, the way women's emotional influence can unconsciously control the emotions and decisions of men? Freud. Yes, the father of psychoanalysis warned that men are deeply vulnerable to the unconscious forces exerted by the opposite sex. Freud didn't just talk about desire or sexuality, he also pointed out a truth that has been largely ignored by modern psychology and culture. Women crave control in relationships, but it's not always obvious, it's not always intentional, and it's certainly not always malicious. Often this need for control plays out in the most subtle, emotionally manipulative ways that men don't even recognize until it's too late. Freud said, women always seek to take control in relationships, even in the most innocent ways. What he meant was that even in the most seemingly loving, nurturing gestures, there's an underlying force that can manipulate a man's thoughts, emotions, and ultimately, his identity. This is where the power struggle begins. The problem is most men aren't even aware of it. They think they're in love, but in reality, they're being controlled, emotionally entangled, without even knowing how or why. In this video, we'll uncover Freud's hidden theory about male suffering in relationships. We'll dig deep into his insights about the unconscious dynamics between men and women, and how these forces shape the emotional and psychological lives of men in ways they can't easily escape. Get ready to have your eyes opened, because the truth Freud revealed is not something society wants you to know. It's time to see the world of relationships for what it truly is. To understand the full impact of Freud's theory on relationships, we must first examine his views on the unconscious and its role in human behavior. Freud didn't just study dreams and sexuality, he studied power. In his view, much of our emotional and psychological lives are governed by forces we don't even realize are there. One of the most profound insights Freud offered was his theory on hysteria and sexual dynamics between men and women. At the core of these ideas is the concept that much of human behavior, especially in relationships, is driven by unconscious desires and power struggles, forces that are neither logical nor rational, but deeply emotional and instinctual. Freud argued that women in particular possess a unique ability to manipulate the emotional landscape of relationships, often without even realizing it. Their natural emotional volatility, combined with the power of their feminine mystique, gives them an unconscious ability to dominate the emotional sphere of their partners. But this manipulation is not always intentional. Freud believed that women, like men, are driven by deeply ingrained biological and psychological forces. For women, much of this is rooted in their desire for security, both emotional and material. However, this desire for security often leads to emotional manipulation as a way of maintaining that control. In Freud's view, the feminine drive to attract and retain a mate is not just about desire or love, it's about securing a stable emotional environment. Women are by nature more attuned to emotional signals, more capable of emotional expression, and thus they can often leverage this awareness to influence their male partners, often without overt intention. Freud recognized that this dynamic often leads to psychological imbalances in relationships. While a woman may not be consciously trying to manipulate her partner, her emotional state can easily override his rational thought. In doing so, she disarms him of his autonomy, turning him into a puppet of his own emotional reactivity. This is where Freud's theory intersects with the modern understanding of emotional dependence. When a man's identity becomes entangled in his partner's emotional world, he loses his ability to act independently. the relationship becomes a power dynamic where one partner's emotions govern the course of the whole relationship while the other becomes increasingly reactive and dependent. What makes this particularly insidious is that the manipulation is often subtle and disguised as affection or care. Freud highlighted that many men fail to recognize that they are being manipulated because the methods of control are emotional, not physical. Women can use tactics like guilt, silence, or emotional withdrawal to manipulate a man's behavior, creating a constant state of tension that he believes is rooted in love or desire. These emotional manipulations, in Freud's words, turn into a game of psychological warfare where the man is unknowingly drawn into an emotional tug-of-war. The more he tries to please her, the more he compromises his own needs and desires. The more he gives, the less he retains of himself. Freud's work on sexual dynamics is also crucial to understanding this imbalance. He argued that sexual attraction is often the primary motivator for both men and women in relationships, but it is driven by unconscious desires that men and women often don't fully understand. Women, according to Freud, often wield this sexual power using their ability to charm and attract as a tool for emotional influence. A man deeply driven by sexual attraction may confuse his emotional submission as a form of love, not realizing that the emotional tension in the relationship is a form of unacknowledged power, a power that is largely governed by the woman's emotional state, her desires, and her ability to provoke responses. Freud's theory was not one of blame, but of awareness. He wanted men to understand that the struggle for emotional and psychological power in relationships is often unconscious. Men must understand that emotional control is not always overt. It is not always in the form of commands, but rather in the emotional push and pull of affection, guilt, and love. In a sense, Freud was offering a psychological map to navigate the often invisible terrain of relationships. He was not telling men to avoid relationships, but to understand the forces at play. By recognizing the emotional manipulation and understanding the unconscious drives behind them, men can reclaim their power, their autonomy, and their rational clarity in relationships. In the modern context, many of these concepts remain highly relevant. Women today, just like in Freud's time, possess the ability to stir deep emotional reactions in men, using emotional expressions and subtle manipulations to draw them in. But in modern society, this dynamic is often left unspoken, shrouded in a cultural narrative that privileges romantic ideals over psychological clarity. The danger lies in not recognizing these dynamics, in ignoring the subtle ways in which emotional manipulation can creep into a relationship, all the while masquerading as love, affection, or care. Freud's theory urges men to remain aware of how their emotions are being influenced and to question whether they are truly in control of their feelings or simply reacting to someone else's needs. If a man can learn to identify when his emotions are being manipulated, whether through guilt, emotional withdrawal, or subtle demands, he can regain his rational self-control and avoid being drawn into unhealthy dependent dynamics. Understanding Freud's theory of emotional and psychological dynamics isn't about demonizing women. It's about recognizing the unconscious forces that shape both men's and women's behaviors in relationships. Armed with this awareness, men can navigate relationships with greater clarity, autonomy, and purpose. Certainly, here is part 3. The signs men must watch out for, 1,000 words continuing from the previous sections. This part will highlight the subtle forms of emotional control and manipulation that men should be aware of, providing practical advice for recognizing and avoiding these dynamics in relationships. It's easy to think that emotional manipulation is something overt, something obvious. After all, if someone were trying to control you, surely you'd notice, right? The reality is much more subtle and insidious than that. The emotional manipulation Freud spoke of is often wrapped in affection, care, and love. It operates beneath the surface, making it difficult to see for what it truly is until it's too late. So what exactly should men be watching out for? What are the signs that they might be falling into a pattern of emotional manipulation without even realizing it? 1. The silent treatment. emotional withdrawal as control. One of the most powerful and yet most subtle forms of manipulation is the silent treatment. Freud identified this as a form of passive aggression, a way of withdrawing affection and attention as a means of controlling the emotional climate of the relationship. It doesn't start with an explosion or a fight. It starts with silence, and the silence feels heavy, thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. The woman may withdraw from the man, give him the cold shoulder, or refuse to engage emotionally with him. At first, this might seem like a small issue, but over time the man feels compelled to fix it to bridge the gap. The longer the silence lingers, the more desperate he becomes to restore harmony, often giving up his own needs and desires to make her feel better. The key here is that this behavior is not always a sign of anger or frustration. It is a calculated emotional tool used to manipulate the man's actions and emotional state. Freud would say that the woman unconsciously is drawing the man into her emotional world, where he is compelled to perform, to act, to behave in ways that align with her desires. 2. Guilt tripping. Manipulating through responsibility. Another powerful emotional manipulation tactic is guilt tripping. Guilt is one of the most potent tools of emotional control. It is one of the reasons why men often feel like they are constantly not enough in relationships. It creates an emotional imbalance where the man feels constantly responsible for his partner's feelings, mood, and well-being. This could manifest in subtle phrases such as, "You don't care about me like you used to. If you really loved me, you would do this for me. I feel alone, but I guess you don't care enough to help." These phrases aren't necessarily said with malicious intent. In fact, many women may not even be aware that they are using guilt as a tool of manipulation. The result, however, is the same. The man begins to feel as though he must act in a way that meets her emotional needs, even at the expense of his own well-being. Freud would argue that this dynamic taps into unconscious power struggles. The woman unconsciously may use guilt to reinforce her control over the man's emotional state. He becomes unable to make decisions without worrying about her reaction, and his focus shifts from what is good for him to what is good for her, which creates a toxic cycle of emotional dependency. 3. Playing the victim, creating emotional dependency. Victimhood is another tool often used to manipulate emotions. When a woman portrays herself as a victim, whether it's through past trauma, current difficulties, or simply emotional vulnerability, she may unknowingly trap her partner in a dynamic where he feels compelled to protect, fix, and sacrifice for her. This can often feel like the right thing to do. After all, who doesn't want to protect their partner? But over time, the man begins to feel a sense of emotional responsibility that starts to become overwhelming. He feels like he must be the savior, constantly putting her needs before his own, constantly trying to fix her emotional state. Freud's theory on hysteria comes into play here. Emotions that remain unresolved, unaddressed, or unprocessed by either partner can spill over into the relationship, creating a cycle of emotional manipulation. The man feels the pressure to always be the strong one, the provider of emotional stability, and the caretaker of her distress. This, however, can lead to emotional burnout. The more a man sacrifices his own emotional well-being to save the woman he loves, the more he loses touch with his own desires, his own emotional needs, and eventually his sense of self. 4. Gaslighting, altering perception to create doubt. Gaslighting is one of the most destructive forms of emotional manipulation, and it's deeply rooted in Freud's idea of psychological projection. In gaslighting, the manipulator will repeatedly tell the victim that their perceptions, feelings, or thoughts are wrong, often to the point where the victim starts questioning their own reality. For example, if a man brings up an issue he's having in the relationship, and the woman responds with something like, "You're just being paranoid. You're overthinking it again." She's subtly shifting the blame back onto him. Over time, this tactic makes the man doubt his own judgment, his own instincts, and his reality. Freud would describe this as a form of psychological control, where the woman projects her own insecurities or fears onto the man, making him question his own emotional responses. The longer this dynamic continues, the more the man becomes emotionally disoriented, unable to trust his own perceptions and feeling emotionally overwhelmed by the doubt she instills. 5. The use of emotional withdrawal as punishment. A more overt but still highly subtle form of control involves using emotional withdrawal as a punishment. This can look like shutting down emotionally when things don't go her way, withholding affection, or becoming distant when the man doesn't act in the way she expects. The manipulation here is that the woman uses her affection or lack thereof to control the man's behavior. He begins to associate emotional closeness with compliance and emotional distance with rejection. Freud would likely describe this as a reinforced emotional response, where the man is conditioned to act in certain ways to avoid emotional pain. This form of emotional withdrawal isn't just about punishing the man, but about gaining control of the emotional dynamics in the relationship. The more she withdraws, the more he feels the need to please her, further reinforcing her emotional dominance. When we talk about women's desire for control in relationships, it's important to understand that it is not driven by malicious intent or an inherent desire to dominate. Rather, it stems from deep psychological and biological needs, many of which remain unconscious. Freud's theory of psychosexual development and his exploration of hysteria give us a powerful lens through which to view these dynamics not as manipulative behavior, but as unconscious drives that influence relationships in ways that both partners often fail to recognize. At the core of this desire for control lies security. Freud argued that women, due to their roles in reproduction and child-rearing, have a deeply ingrained desire to ensure stability and protection in their relationships. This manifests in the unconscious urge to control emotional and psychological dynamics in order to maintain a stable environment, not just for herself, but for her family and children as well. This is not a power struggle in the traditional sense, but a subconscious attempt to create order out of emotional chaos, the desire for emotional stability. Women, Freud suggested, are far more in tune with emotional rhythms and instincts. Their sensitivity to emotional cues, often perceived as a strength, can become an unconscious mechanism to exert influence in relationships. This sensitivity means that a woman's emotional state can profoundly affect the dynamics between her and her partner. When a woman feels that emotional stability is threatened, whether by external circumstances or internal fears, she often seeks to regain control by influencing her partner's emotions. This drive isn't necessarily rooted in an explicit desire to manipulate. Instead, it's driven by the need for emotional equilibrium. When her emotional state is out of balance, she may unconsciously seek to bring her partner into the emotional dynamic through affection, withdrawal, guilt, or even creating tension. She may not consciously realize it, but this is often a way to ensure that she is not left vulnerable to her own emotional instability. The reenactment of childhood dynamics. Freud's ideas about childhood development offer further insight into why women may desire control in relationships. During early development, Freud suggested that a girl's relationship with her father plays a crucial role in shaping her unconscious desires in later life. The unresolved emotional patterns from this relationship can influence how she seeks validation, love, and emotional security from men. Freud theorized that a woman's desire for a dominant male figure, at least unconsciously, could manifest in a desire to control the emotional dynamics in her adult relationships. She doesn't consciously want to control her partner, but seeks a dominant emotional space because it mirrors her early need for stability and reassurance. For men, this often means being caught in a dynamic where his own emotional needs become secondary. The woman's emotional state tends to dictate the mood and direction of the relationship, and the man often feels that his emotions are secondary, especially when he fails to meet her emotional needs. Projection and unconscious control. Freud's theory of projection provides another crucial insight into why some women seek control in relationships. Projection occurs when an individual attributes their own emotions or impulses to another person. In the context of relationships, women may project their own vulnerabilities and emotional needs onto their male partners, and in doing so, unconsciously demand that the man fulfill these unmet emotional needs. For example, a woman may feel insecure about her own emotional or psychological state. Rather than confronting these issues head-on, she projects them onto her partner, expecting him to alleviate her fears or anxieties. In this way, she unconsciously positions him as the emotional anchor, even though he may not be equipped or ready to bear the weight of these expectations. The problem is that the more she projects her needs, the more the man feels compelled to fulfill them, even at the cost of his own emotional well-being. The shift in roles. From equal partner to emotional manager. Freud's exploration of hysteria is also relevant here. He observed that some women unconsciously express emotional distress in ways that can lead to psychological manipulation. Emotional outbursts or irrational fears, what Freud called hysteria, are ways of expressing unmet needs, but when these expressions are frequent or intense, they can inadvertently turn the relationship into one where the woman takes on the role of a manager of emotions. In these relationships, the man often finds himself playing a secondary role where his partner's emotional world dictates the tone of the relationship. This shift can be gradual. At first, the man may feel compelled to protect and provide, but over time he may begin to lose his own sense of direction, becoming emotionally dependent on her validation, approval, and emotional stability. For Freud, this type of emotional shift isn't just about creating dependency, it's about reaffirming dominance. Unconsciously, the woman seeks to control the emotional atmosphere, and by doing so, she becomes the center of the emotional universe of the relationship. The man, in his desire to please or avoid conflict, can end up forfeiting his own emotional autonomy. His emotional responses become a reflection of her moods, and the once vibrant and independent man becomes a passive figure reacting to her cues rather than living freely. The power of the feminine mystique, unconscious control without malice. Finally, we must acknowledge that the control dynamic described by Freud is not always intentional. The power to influence and control emotional dynamics often stems from a deep-seated desire for security, a desire that many women do not even realize they are acting on. The emotional volatility that Freud identified as part of feminine nature can create an unconscious magnetism, drawing men into emotional states that they can't easily escape from. A woman's vulnerability, or her subtle expressions of need, can pull a man into a psychological orbit where he feels responsible for her emotional well-being. This doesn't make her a manipulator, it makes her a woman unconsciously acting on instinct. The real issue is that men often don't recognize it. When a man finds himself in a relationship where emotional control is wielded unconsciously or subtly, the immediate effects are often difficult to notice. At first, the exchanges seem like normal relationship dynamics, compromise understanding and emotional expression. But as time progresses, the toll of this control becomes more apparent, not in dramatic outbursts, but in quiet, insidious shifts that affect his mental health, sense of self, and emotional stability. 1. Loss of identity. One of the most significant long-term effects of emotional control is the slow erosion of a man's identity. This doesn't happen overnight, but over the course of months or even years. When a man is emotionally manipulated, he gradually starts to adapt his behavior, thoughts, and responses to please his partner or to avoid conflict. He might find himself disregarding his own needs in favor of keeping the emotional peace or fulfilling his partner's unspoken emotional demands. Over time, this creates a scenario where his own wants, dreams, and values are buried beneath the weight of his partner's expectations. He becomes less in touch with what he desires or needs. The more he shapes his life around her emotional landscape, the further he drifts from his own path. His once vibrant individuality, full of passions, goals, and a clear sense of direction begins to fade. He may not even realize it. At first, he simply starts to feel like something is missing, but doesn't know where to look to find it. 2. Emotional exhaustion and anxiety. Another profound consequence is emotional exhaustion. Freud's theory of hysteria indicated how emotional upheaval can lead to a breakdown of mental balance. When a man is constantly on edge trying to meet emotional needs to placate or satisfy his partner's shifting moods, he can begin to feel chronically drained. This exhaustion often comes from the sense that his emotional state is not his own. Every time his partner is upset, anxious, or distant, he internalizes it. He feels responsible for her emotional well-being, thinking that if he just does the right thing, say the right words, act in the right way, her distress will dissipate. Yet this cycle is never-ending. No matter how much he sacrifices, how much energy he gives, it feels like it's never enough. The constant emotional strain eventually manifests as anxiety. The man becomes hyper-aware of his partner's moods, always walking on eggshells, trying to read her unspoken cues. He might feel anxious about every small interaction, fearful of her silence, her anger, or her disappointment. This anxiety builds over time as he loses the ability to simply exist in a relationship without the constant pressure of emotional performance. It becomes hard to differentiate his own anxiety from hers, and the line between their emotional states blurs. 3. Decreased self-esteem and confidence. As a man becomes emotionally manipulated, he often starts to question his own worth. When a partner's affection is unpredictable or dependent on how well he meets her emotional demands, he can begin to feel that he is not good enough. He might start to doubt his own decisions, judgments, and abilities, becoming increasingly reliant on her validation. This leads to a decrease in self-esteem. The man starts to measure his worth based on how well he can fulfill her emotional needs, rather than how well he is living according to his own values and desires. When he feels he's not meeting her expectations, his sense of self-worth shrinks. Over time, this creates a deeply rooted belief that he is not valuable on his own terms. He is only valuable in relation to how well he can serve her emotional needs. 4. Anxiety and fear of conflict. One of the most subtle and insidious consequences of emotional manipulation is the fear of conflict. In relationships where control is exerted through emotional withdrawal, guilt-tripping, or passive aggression, conflict becomes something to fear. The man might avoid addressing issues, afraid that confronting his partner will lead to emotional outbursts, silence, or further manipulation. This fear of conflict is rooted in the anxiety that he will not be able to navigate the emotional storm that follows. He may internalize her anger or sadness, feeling personally responsible for her feelings. Rather than seeing conflict as an opportunity for growth or understanding, he begins to view it as a personal failure. He avoids it at all costs, either by compromising on his needs or by withdrawing from the conversation. 5. A loss of autonomy and independence. As emotional manipulation continues, the man often finds himself losing his independence. Freud's theory on psychological dependence describes how emotional manipulation can create a deep-seated dependency. The more a man compromises his own needs to please his partner, the less autonomy he has. He starts to prioritize her emotional well-being over his own, and in doing so, he forfeits his ability to make decisions without considering her response. This dependency can feel like a trap. The man feels as though he must conform to her desires, modify his behavior, and adjust his feelings to match hers. Over time, he becomes emotionally enmeshed in the relationship, where his sense of identity and freedom is completely tied to his partner's approval and emotional state. Breaking free from the grip of emotional manipulation and reclaiming your power is not an easy path. It requires courage, self-awareness, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. But it is possible, and it starts with awareness. The first step in escaping control is recognizing the manipulation. This means becoming aware of the subtle dynamics at play, the emotional withdrawal, the guilt-tripping, the silent treatment, and the constant need to appease. Men often become so emotionally enmeshed in their relationships that they don't realize they're being manipulated. But once you identify these patterns, you begin to take back your own emotional sovereignty. The next step is setting boundaries. Boundaries are essential for maintaining your emotional and psychological independence. They allow you to protect your sense of self and establish limits on what behavior is acceptable. Start by clearly communicating your needs and values to your partner. Let them know what you will and will not tolerate. It's not about being harsh, it's about being clear and firm.